Welcome to Hourglass Secrets. In the early decades of the 18th century, England was a kingdom defined by strict laws and rigid social order. The streets of London bustled with commerce, yet shadows stretched across every alley and narrow court. Life for women of modest means was a daily struggle, bound by the expectations of marriage, household service, and survival in a city where opportunity was scarce and hardship plentiful. Imagine a woman in her mid-30s, born into the rural simplicity of Warwickshire, arriving in the teeming heart of London. This was Catherine Hayes, whose life had been shaped by the relentless grind of poverty and servitude. From a young age, she had laboured in households that demanded obedience and offered little respite. Her marriage, arranged without her in-laws' approval, promised little comfort. John Hayes, a carpenter with occasional dealings in small-scale trade, became her companion, yet the household soon became a place of fear rather than security. The first signs of domestic torment were subtle but relentless. Neighbours would later recall seeing Catherine hurriedly flee from her own home after a harsh beating, bruises hidden beneath her modest clothing. Any fleeting attention from another man could provoke violence, and even her devout attempts to maintain her religious observances were met with mockery and restriction. The couple bore 12 children, yet the fragility of life in those times meant that only a few survived beyond infancy. Amid this daily pressure, Catherine began to see escape in the unthinkable. Her son from an earlier period, Thomas Billings, re-entered her life, offering companionship and a listening ear. Alongside him, Thomas Wood, a sympathetic labourer, frequented the household, providing a semblance of support absent from her marriage. In whispered conversations, Catherine spoke of the relentless cruelty she endured and suggested a plan so dark that it would shatter the ordinary perception of domestic life, removing her husband by force. Roles were carefully assigned. Billings would act decisively, Wood would assist, and Catherine herself would ensure the household appeared undisturbed, concealing the actions as if nothing were amiss. To outsiders, the household ran as usual. Catherine moved through the rooms with quiet composure, tending to lamps and household chores, while John Hayes drank and slept, unaware of the plotting that surrounded him. Then came the morning of March 2nd, 1726. A stillness hung over the home, unnerving to neighbours accustomed to the clatter and hum of daily life. Along the riverbank at Millbank, a portion of human remains was discovered, immediately drawing the attention of authorities. Identification soon confirmed the grim reality. John Hayes had disappeared under suspicious circumstances. Catherine's composure did not falter. She claimed he was away on business, a statement that would soon crumble under the weight of evidence and witness testimony. The threads of her carefully maintained routine were unraveling, setting the stage for the inquest that would follow. Before we begin, please hit subscribe and tell me, what state are you listening from? The discovery of John Hayes' remains at Millbank sent ripples of shock through the local community. News travelled quickly along Tyburn Road, where neighbours whispered of the missing husband and the eerie stillness that had settled over the household. The authorities moved with deliberate care, bringing the fragments of the body to Westminster for formal examination, ensuring every procedure adhered to the standards of the day. Local residents, drawn by curiosity and concern, gathered along the riverbank, their faces reflecting a mix of horror and disbelief. Among them, a few recognized Hayes, confirming the identification. Tyburn Road was no longer a quiet stretch of London. It had become a stage for suspicion and apprehension. Catherine Hayes maintained a composed exterior, assuring neighbours that her husband was away on business, even as investigators began to scrutinise the household. Her calmness, however, could not mask the growing sense that all was not as it seemed. The inquest commenced at St. Margaret's under the guidance of the coroner, a figure whose authority demanded respect and attention. Witnesses were called to recount what they had observed. Mrs. Springate, who occupied the upper room of the house, spoke of the unusual stillness on the morning of March 2nd. Sounds she had expected, footsteps, domestic activity, the familiar creaks of a busy household, were absent. Even small noises seemed deliberately muted, as if the house itself conspired to conceal the events that had transpired. Further testimony painted a picture of domestic strain and violence. Neighbours recounted the repeated beatings inflicted upon Catherine by her husband, her attempts to flee, and the pervasive fear that had defined her daily life. Her interactions with Thomas Billings and Thomas Wood, previously casual or supportive, now took on a darker significance, hinting at the secret. Arrangements discussed behind closed doors. When Thomas Wood was questioned, he revealed the grim details of Catherine's plan. Billings was to carry out the decisive act, Wood was to assist, and Catherine would manage concealment. She had promised them a reward and justified the scheme by pointing to the years of abuse and hardship she endured. Separately, Thomas Billings confirmed these accounts, acknowledging that Catherine had been the principal instigator, her influence central to the orchestration of the crime. Despite the mounting evidence, Catherine steadfastly denied the allegations. Her statements were measured, brief, and devoid of confession, but her composed exterior contrasted sharply with the gravity of the accusations. Yet, in the eyes of the law, motive and planning mattered little compared to the act itself. Petty treason, the crime for which she would eventually stand trial, was considered a grave violation, punishable with the most severe penalties. As the inquest concluded, the authorities prepared to advance the case to trial. Catherine, along with Billings and Wood, was formally remanded into custody, their fates entwined with the rigid laws of 18th century England. The stage was set for the Old Bailey to hear their story, a trial that would captivate London and expose the hidden shadows of a seemingly ordinary household. The community watched closely, aware that the outcome would not only define justice for one family, but also reflect the uncompromising power of the law and the consequences of a life lived under relentless oppression. April 1726 arrived with a sense of grim anticipation. Londoners crowded the streets near the Old Bailey, eager to witness the trial that had become the talk of the city. The case of Catherine Hayes was no ordinary crime. It was a rare instance of petty treason, a charge reserved for subordinates who defied their social superiors, in this case, a wife accused of orchestrating the murder of her husband. Public interest was intense, drawing spectators from every walk of life, including members of the gentry who claimed the opera benches, while the general populace packed the galleries. The court was presided over by Lord Chief Justice Raymond, whose presence lent authority to the proceedings. Witnesses from the inquest were called once more. Mrs. Springate recounted the eerie stillness of Tyburn Road on the morning of the 2nd of March, emphasizing how out of place the calm seemed in a household accustomed to daily noise. Fishermen and neighbors described the grim discovery at Mill Bank and confirmed John Hayes's identity. Their testimonies painted a chilling picture of planning, secrecy, and deliberate concealment. Then came the statements of the co-accused. Thomas Wood, when confronted, spoke of the careful plotting and the promises Catherine had made, portraying her as the orchestrator of a plan that left little to chance. Thomas Billings corroborated this account, highlighting her role in assigning tasks and instructing them on concealing evidence. Both men's confessions were consistent and detailed, leaving little room for doubt regarding the sequence of events. Catherine's defense was minimal. She denied all allegations, offering no witnesses on her behalf. Her replies were measured and restrained, a sharp contrast to the graphic descriptions provided by the prosecution. Yet the law focused on action and planning, not the suffering that had preceded it. The jury list is. Ned attentively, weighing the statements and evidence against the backdrop of a society where household hierarchies were enforced with near absolute authority. The prosecution emphasized that the murder was premeditated, calculated, and executed with precision. The promise of financial reward, the allocation of roles, and the deliberate concealment of the crime all contributed to the weight of the case. In the eyes of the law, Catherine's personal suffering did not excuse her actions. Motive was acknowledged, but did not mitigate guilt. After hours of deliberation, the jury returned their verdict. Catherine Hayes was found guilty of petty treason, a crime regarded with exceptional severity. Billings and Wood were found guilty of murder. The sentence reflected the strict codes of justice, hanging for the men and execution by burning for Catherine. The courtroom murmured with shock and fascination. Newspapers and broadsheets would soon carry accounts of the trial, cementing its place in the public consciousness and marking Catherine's story as one of both horror and historical significance. The trial at the Old Bailey revealed not only the grim reality of one household, but also the uncompromising nature of 18th century law, where personal suffering and circumstance were secondary to the demands of justice. London had borne witness to a tragedy that would echo for decades, a reminder of the consequences that awaited those who defied societal and domestic hierarchies. Following the verdict at the Old Bailey, the weight of justice pressed heavily upon Catherine Hayes. Londoners spoke in hushed tones of the rarity of the case, a woman convicted of petty treason, a crime carrying the most severe consequences. The law was unyielding, and Catherine's fate was sealed by statutes that had long enforced the authority of household hierarchies with merciless precision. Preparations for the executions were meticulous. Thomas Billings and Thomas Wood awaited their sentences with the grim understanding of what was to come. Wood, weakened by ill health, would not survive long enough to face the rope, passing away in Newgate Prison before the sentence could be carried out. Billings, however, remained in custody, resigned to the certainty of hanging. Catherine herself faced the most harrowing aspect of English justice: execution by burning, a penalty designed to demonstrate the unassailable authority of the law over those who defied it. In the weeks leading to May the 9th, public interest did not wane. Broadsheets and pamphlets recounted the details of the case, dissecting the cruelty of Hayes's domestic life and the planning that led to her husband's murder. Commentators debated the justice of the punishment. Some argued it was warranted, a necessary demonstration of the law's strength, while others questioned whether a woman's act, born from years of abuse and oppression, merited such extreme retribution. Yet legal tradition left no room for leniency. The statute prescribed a precise method of execution, and officials were bound to enforce it. Catherine, confined in her cell, displayed remarkable composure. Accounts from contemporaries describe her as calm, even reflective, as the day of reckoning approached. Documents circulated among the public, including a statement attributed to her, hinted at acknowledgement of her actions while also emphasis in the prolonged suffering she had endured at the hands of her husband. Though not regarded as a formal confession, it added a layer of complexity to public perception, evoking both horror and reluctant empathy. On the appointed day, the streets leading to Tyburn were crowded with spectators. The execution was carried out exactly as prescribed by law. Billings was hanged first, meeting his fate with the grim acceptance of a condemned man. Catherine was then secured to the stake. Efforts to shorten her suffering were insufficient, and the flames consumed her, marking the end of a life shaped by hardship, domestic cruelty, and the inexorable reach of 18th-century justice. The conclusion of the executions did not mark the end of discussion. Newspapers revisited the case, reflecting on the severity of punishments for petty treason and the gendered nature of the law. While Catherine Hayes's life had ended, her story endured as a cautionary tale, a window into a society where law, hierarchy, and personal tragedy intersected with brutal clarity. Through the public scrutiny and the harsh finality of the law, the case of Catherine Hayes left a lasting imprint on English criminal history, highlighting both the rigidity of justice and the human costs of domestic oppression. The flames at Tyburn had consumed Catherine Hayes, yet the echoes of her story reverberated far beyond the execution site. London's streets buzzed with whispers, broadsheets circulated accounts of the crime and its grim resolution, and public discourse turned to the harshness of the law. Petty treason, particularly when committed by a wife against her husband, was rare, and Catherine's case became a reference point in debates about justice, gender, and punishment. Observers reflected on the life she had led, a woman trapped within a household of relentless cruelty, raising children under constant fear and subjected to repeated violence. While the law focused on her actions, the public grappled with the context. Was she merely a villain, or also a victim of circumstance? Pamphlets questioned whether society's rigid enforcement of domestic hierarchy had contributed to a tragedy that might have been prevented had support or intervention been possible. The deaths of her co-accused also drew attention. Thomas Wood, already weakened by illness, had died before facing the full penalty, highlighting concerns about prison conditions and the treatment of convicts. Thomas Billings awaited his execution in Newgate, an example of the law's unflinching reach. In these outcomes, contemporaries saw both the severity of justice and the human cost that accompanied strict adherence to statutes. In the years that followed, Catherine Hayes's story was cited repeatedly in discussions about legal reform. Her execution by burning remained a focal point of critique. Scholars and commentators noted the unusual nature of her sentence for a woman and the emotional intensity it generated among witnesses. The public debated whether laws governing petty treason were fair or whether they disproportionately punished women, enforcing societal hierarchies in ways that modern readers might now see as draconian. Yet beyond the legal debates, Catherine's narrative endured as a tale of human suffering, endurance, and the complexities of morality under pressure. Neighbors remembered her quiet resilience, her ability to navigate daily life under the shadow of abuse, and the secret desperation that led to her final, fatal decisions. The tension between her private torment and her public crime fascinated contemporaries and has continued to intrigue historians, writers, and audiences of true crime narratives alike. Through the lens of history, Catherine Hayes's life and death illuminate the brutal realities faced by women in 18th century England. Her story is not merely about crime, it is about power, survival, and the ways in which society, law, and personal circumstance collide with irreversible consequences. The case remains a chilling reminder that behind every sensational trial lies a human story, complex, tragic, and profoundly instructive. The story of Catherine Hayes did not end with the flames at Tyburn. Her case became a touchstone for discussions on justice, gender, and the application of law in 18th century England. Historians and legal scholars have since examined her life as an example of the tension between strict statutes and human circumstance. Though convicted of petty treason, the broader narrative reveals a woman ensnared in relentless domestic cruelty, striving to survive in a society with few avenues for support or escape. Over time, the trial and execution contributed to critical reflection on the punishment of women under the law. The statute of petty treason, which had sanctioned execution by burning for wives who murdered their husbands, came under increasing scrutiny. Catherine Hayes' case, cited in numerous broadsheets, pamphlets, and legal commentaries, highlighted the extreme severity of such sentences and their disproportionate application to women. By the late 18th century, the practice was formally abolished, closing a dark chapter in English criminal law and marking the gradual evolution toward a more equitable approach to punishment. Public memory of the case endured, not only because of its legal significance, but also because of the human story it revealed. Catherine's life, filled with hardship, abuse, and the quiet suffering of countless days, resonates across centuries. Her narrative invites reflection on the pressures faced by women in a patriarchal society, the limitations of legal protection, and the moral complexities that arise when law, desperation, and survival intersect. The co-accused, Thomas Billings and Thomas Wood, also remain part of this historical narrative. Billings met his end by hanging, as decreed by the court, while Wood's death in Newgate underscored the harsh realities of prison life at the time. Their involvement, coupled with Catherine's instigation, illustrates the interplay of influence, coercion, and agency, offering a sobering look at how ordinary people could become entwined in acts of extreme violence. Even centuries later, Catherine Hayes's story captivates audiences. For true crime enthusiasts, historians, and writers, it is a window into the domestic, legal, and societal pressures of 18th century England. Her tale is one of tragedy and consequence, reflecting a world where the line between victim and perpetrator could blur, and where the law enforced hierarchy with unyielding force. Ultimately, Catherine Hayes's legacy is a reminder of the human dimension behind historical crime. It challenges us to consider the circumstances that lead ordinary people to extraordinary acts, the rigidity of laws that govern behavior, and the lasting impact such cases have on society's understanding of justice, morality, and gender. In remembering her story, we not only confront the stark realities of the past, but also gain insight into the evolution of law and the enduring quest for fairness in human affairs.